A couple of weeks ago, I made a video about the 10th Amendment. I think it's time we dove into the 9th. You ready to learn some more about the Constitution? Let's go. I'm Brian. I make videos about law and civics. Please share, comment, get this out there. This is really important information about your Constitution. You deserve to understand it. And the more you share, the more people learn. Let's do this. This is going to be another one of my constitutional architecture videos, so we are going to start with our map. If you haven't seen it before, go back and watch one of the other videos. It might save you some time. For now, there we go. Okay, I'm going to do a real quick refresher on this map. Before we get started, there are going to be a couple of arguments that I use as examples in this video. I'm just using them as demonstrations to help clarify a definition. And I really don't want 400 comments explaining why the example doesn't work in real life. So, if you feel that you absolutely have to argue about this point, instead, I want you to argue whether or not this is an amazing t-shirt from the Sly Mongoose in Maui, which is a bar that everybody should go to because it's awesome if you ever go to Maui. Argue your points in favor or against. Now that that's sorted, let's get to work. Quick refresher, this is our wall of federalism. Federalism separates the federal national government from everything else in the Constitution. Above the federalism wall are our 7 articles. The first, second, and third articles of the Constitution define the powers of Congress, the executive branch, and the judiciary. These orange walls represent the separation of powers. Everything above the wall is something the federal government can do. Everything below the wall is something the federal government cannot do. Below the wall, we have our first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, our states, and all of the people that live in our states. Now, I want to stop for a second and have a little conversation with you about the difference between rights and powers. I am going to use definitions for these two words that some of you may not agree with. Please just use them for the purposes of this video. Sometimes they'll be a little different, but just for this video, we're going to stick with them. This is another one of these red t-shirt issues. Okay, let's start with a power. A power is something exercised by the government against someone, against its citizens, against the states, against another country. But the powers of our federal government are listed up here. State governments also have powers, and we'll talk about those in a second. Now, let's talk about a right. A right is something held by an individual as a protection against the government. Our most well-known constitutional rights in this country are listed in Amendments 1 through 8 of the U.S. Constitution. These amendments act as shields around the individuals against the power of the government. I'm going to show you an example now, but it's one that would not work in real life. It's another red t-shirt thing. Let's say it's just a few years into this whole America thing, and I am a farmer in New Hampshire. That's me. And I decide I want to start printing a newspaper about how much I hate Congress. And I am going to sell that newspaper in Massachusetts. Well, Congress does not like this. And one of the specific powers that Congress has is the power to regulate interstate commerce. So Commerce writes a law that says, I am not allowed to print newspapers and sell them across state lines. In other words, Congress has taken one of their powers that is enumerated in the first article, something they can do, and exercised it against me. But Congress doesn't know what they're dealing with because I have a secret weapon. Right here in the First Amendment, I have a shield against Congress, a right that protects my freedom of speech. So as Congress exercises their power, I exercise my right. And Congress's power, whew, shoots right off. Okay, what I just demonstrated is what happens when a power and a right collide. But understand that a power comes from the government and a right protects the human. As an aside, when a power hits a right, it doesn't always shoot off into nowhere. Sometimes there's some negotiation to see which one is stronger. But both the power and the right come from the Constitution. So how do we decide which one is more important? Well, that's pretty much the entire body of constitutional law, trying to balance powers against rights and decide how we decide which one wins. Usually there's some little tests in there and they try to find some way to preserve the best parts of both. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. But that's actually not what we're here to talk about. I just needed to define powers and rights for a minute, at least as we're going to talk about them here. But one more time, up here we have powers, down here we have rights. What about these two? While the articles define the powers of government and 1 through 8 define the rights of individuals, 9 and 10 do something a little bit different. They're both a little less concrete than the others, a little more ethereal up in the clouds, and they're also kind of similar. They're kind of cousins. So we're going to start with 10, even though we've already done 10. You can go back and watch that video. So the 10th Amendment says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The most important word here for what we're talking about right now is the word powers. The 10th Amendment is only talking about powers, not about rights. And it talks about distributing those powers between the federal government and the state government, whether the people are involved. We have a whole video on that, but it's only about powers. So what about rights? Well, now it's time to talk about its cousin, the 9th Amendment. The Ninth Amendment says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, right here, number 1 through 8, shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So what is this saying? The Ninth Amendment says, okay, we have 8 rights listed in the Constitution, but the fact that there are only 8 listed does not mean that there are only 8 constitutional rights. The Ninth Amendment tells us that these 8 rights listed here, these 8 shields against government power, are not the only rights. There are 8 listed rights, but the Constitution implies others. Other rights are implied, other protections are implied, other shields are implied, and they are implied by the Ninth Amendment. Okay, great, this is lovely and philosophical. What do we do with this information? Well, let's talk case law. Now, I am going to stick to a case called Griswold v. Connecticut on this one. There aren't a lot of cases about the Ninth Amendment, but I think this is the best one, and so this is the one I'm going to do. But Griswold's also a really good example of why we don't have any firm case law in the Ninth Amendment. Griswold v. Connecticut was about the right of a doctor to prescribe the pill to a married woman. There's a whole side conversation, because it's 1965, about whether it should be prescribed to unmarried women. Whatever. But the question was, should a married woman who had made a decision with her husband to control their own family planning be stopped from making those decisions because of a state policy? 5 justices did agree that she should not be stopped, and they all agreed on one opinion. But 3 of them added a concurring opinion. If you've watched one of my videos on concurring or plurality opinions, you'll see how this all plays out. But even if they all agree on the same outcome, if only 3 of them agree on part of the opinion, that opinion does not become law. So let's look at the 2 opinions real fast. Now, the main opinion, the opinion of the court, looked at the First, Third, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments and said that all of these amendments kind of had one thing in common. They all revolved around this central concept of privacy. Under the Third Amendment, the government can't just walk into your house with a bunch of soldiers and tell you to house them. But this was rooted in an idea that you were allowed to lead a private life inside of your house. Fourth Amendment keeps you safe from warrantless search and seizure. Same idea, privacy. The court found this privacy idea at the core of all of these different amendments. And even though the word privacy wasn't listed anywhere, the court said there was a penumbra around all of this that included privacy. Penumbra is the court's word, not mine. The primary opinion of the court finds that we have privacy based on these amendments. It uses the 14th Amendment to apply it to the states, and the pill was universally made available. But a concurring opinion was released by 3 of the black robes, hanging on the 9th Amendment. The opinion was written by Justice Goldberg, not Ginsburg. The Chief Justice of the time and Justice Brennan concurred. They said that the 9th Amendment was proffered to quiet expressed fears that a bill of specifically enumerated rights could be sufficiently broad to cover all essential rights, and that the specific mention of certain rights would be interpreted as a denial that others were protected. In other words, this wasn't going to be enough, and they didn't want people thinking that just because these were listed, that was the end of the list. The justice goes on, while this court has had little occasion to interpret the Ninth Amendment, it cannot be presumed that any clause in the Constitution is intended to be without effect. And this is key because a lot of times people like to gloss over some of these things and be like, it's not really important. It is important. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't important. To hold that a right so basic and fundamental and so deep-rooted in our society as the right of privacy in a marriage may be infringed because that right is not guaranteed in so many words by the first 8 amendments to the Constitution is to ignore the Ninth Amendment and give it no effect. Okay, so they're saying here that privacy in the marriage is so fundamental, it has to be included in those Ninth Amendment rights. To not include it would be to assume that the Ninth Amendment means nothing, which we know we can't do. The entire fabric of the Constitution and the purposes that clearly underlie its specific guarantees demonstrate that the rights to marital privacy and to marry and raise a family are of a similar order and magnitude as the fundamental rights specifically protected. So unfortunately, this concurring opinion is not law. 3 people writing it does not make it case law, but it is a highly, highly cited opinion. It laid the groundwork for Roe. It's laid the groundwork for a lot of stuff. A whole lot of case law relies on Griswold. And even though Griswold relies primarily on this argument up here, this penumbras of rights argument, underlying it are 3 out of 5 justices saying, okay, penumbras, sure, but really this is a Ninth Amendment argument. And to ignore the Ninth Amendment is something we cannot do. I'll tell you, I came into this, even after law school, not knowing a lot about the Ninth Amendment because people don't talk about it a lot. I feel much better having read this now, and I certainly feel like I have a pretty strong argument when people tell me that rights that aren't expressly written in the Constitution don't exist. The 9th Amendment is written in the Constitution, and it would argue against that pretty strongly. I would like your comments. What do you think? How does this play out today? How could this information be used? Go take a look at Griswold, go take a look at Roe, and feel free to go read the other opinion and see what you think about the penumbra argument. Do you think it's stronger than the 9th Amendment argument? You guys are learning more and more every day, and I would really like to hear your opinions, so bring them out. Cecilia, Alexandra, and Jeremy, Mike and James, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate all your help. If you'd like to support me, check out my link tree. It's in my profile. There are various ways you can support me, and I really appreciate it. It's keeping me going, keeping me fed, keeping me working. And thank you guys for all of your support. Whew, that was a long one.